let me just start with a quotation that will give you maybe some idea of how I think about education. And it's a quote from Albert Einstein. Einstein said, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift. The rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that has honored the servant and forgotten the gift." Maybe I should say that again, because it's a complicated kind of quote in some respects. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift. The rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that has honored the servant, but has forgotten the gift. And so when I talk about values in education, I come to education with the view that education isn't done to people. It's not something that we have and we give to people. It's something that we share in the evolution and development of humanity, and particularly of young people, but not only of young people, of ourselves and all those who are engaged in education. So when I talk about values in education, I want to reflect on what are those values, where do they come from, why do we have them, how do we use them, can we influence other people's values? And when I talk about leadership, and much of my life has been spent in some kinds of leadership role, I want to talk about what is the nature of that leadership. And so if we look at the next slide, one of the things that I'll be using these slides, Joanne is kindly changing these for me. So to look at the first slide, we move on. There are really then two domains that I'm looking at here, two different ways of thinking. One are the dimensions of leadership, and the other is the source and nature of value. So, and I want to bring these together in some kind of creative way for you so that you get an idea of what I'm looking at in terms of where the values fit into leadership and how is leadership influencing and affected by values. And when talking about leadership, let me just say that leadership exists in all organizations, and leaders should think very hard of how they affect others in an organization. If I've learned anything in leadership, it's to be conscious. How is anything I'm saying or doing affecting and impacting on others? So moving on to the next slide, one of the things I have recognized is the centrality of values in education, that values lie at the center of my view of education. And I have found that there are three values that seem to me to encapsulate the educated person and that take us into ways of thinking about education that give it some kind of purpose and some kind of direction. And these are love and hope and justice. And when I talk about education, I often say there are really only three words that have a central resonance for me in education. Love. Love the people that you work with. A professional love. Have a professional love for people that you care for, that you are focused on their well-being. You know, love isn't a soft thing. Love's tough. And love means giving all of yourself, nothing left up your sleeves. Give all of yourself to others. Do it because we need to create a world of hope, And I don't have to emphasize at the present time in this country and across the world, the absolute centrality of education for hope. If we didn't have hope, actually we would die. It's a necessary requirement for human living, but it's more than that. It gives you a way of thinking and a way of being that is really very important as human beings. Hopelessness is one of the great problems in our world at the present time. And of course, we also want to create a world of justice, making sure that people are treated justly, with respect, with honor, with care, with concern, so that everyone has an opportunity to develop to the maximum possibilities. So education isn't something just done to you. It's based on these deeply human values of loving each other and loving society for its better good, the common good, bringing hope and bringing justice. Next slide. And so these ideas are found in three areas, and you'll find as I talk that this idea of three things will recur again and again. But the idea of values reside in the person, the student, the teacher, the parent, the janitorial staff, the catering staff, the security staff, all of society. There are values in the person. And then there are school values. Now, you could, if you're in a university, you could say they're university values, institutional values, if you like. So the idea of the school having values is going to be something that I'll touch on in terms of leadership, the importance of leadership. And then there are values in society. In our society, there are values that we come across that are widely recognized as being the important values of our society. And these three levels, if you like, all interact with one another. They're not discrete, they're not separate, they form a kind of culture. And I just want to say that I think values, in a way, derive from a subsoil in the culture. And in that subsoil, if I follow that metaphor, trees grow, and the educator helps trees to grow. And these are trees under whose shade we shall not sit, but other generations will. And we have to be very clear that we are, in the world of education, doing something for this generation and generations yet to come. Next slide, please. So, looking then at how this fits into leadership. Well, let me give a model of leadership. And the model of leadership I want to offer is this dispersed leadership, where leadership is not something that is invested only in the chief executive or the head teacher or the principal teacher or the person with responsibility. It's dispersed throughout the organization. And that's a very important kind of leadership, that we have dispersed leadership, that it's distributed, different functions are given to different people. So in a school, different levels of authority and responsibility are given to people, and it all fits together in an important kind of way. And that dispersed leadership, which we could talk about, and of course there are other kinds of leadership. There are, nowadays you hear of middle management leadership, leadership from the outside, leadership from the inside, leadership from everywhere. I just see dispersed leadership, the fact that people everywhere in the school, in this case, have a contribution to make to leadership. Next. So And when one does that, you find a range of values. And these values include, next slide, the idea of mutual respect. If you're going to have distributed leader, you have to respect people. There has to be collegial working together. There has to be a common good that we're working on. There has to be a sense of a deep sense of trust. And maybe just to pause at that one, leadership is often to do with trusting people. If you don't trust somebody, you will not be led by them, nor will you be a good leader. So that important value of trust is very important. And the next slide, one could go on just giving examples, but open attitudes, being open to other ideas. So when looking at distributed leadership, it contains within it a kind of a blending together of mutual respect, collegiate working, the common good, trusting one another, and open attitudes. And so one could go on with this, but I'm going to use that model of leadership as the one that I'm now going to just reflect on with the next slide, which is going to take us forward to look at values in leadership at 3 levels. And this is almost a kind of sub-seminar, if you like, or webinar on leadership and management. But the level of governance, and by governance I mean the governing body or the people responsible for running a school, for developing the school. So governance is the top level, if you like. Then executive level, those who have responsibility for doing things. And thirdly, operational level. And then, keeping going, we find that leadership operates at all of these levels. You find leadership there, and you find values at all of these levels, because there needs to be a shared understanding of what the values are, and there needs to be consistency of practice. So just looking at that set of ideas, just think through, in your school, there must be governance, executive responsibility, and then operational practice. Consistency running through all of these. So there's not just the sort of horizontal hold in this, there's a vertical hold as well. So the idea of developing leadership is about governance, executive, and operational. And so, next slide, moving on, the values of effective governance is about strategic thinking. The importance of strategic thinking is in 3 areas, surprise, surprise. Having a vision, the clarity of vision is vitally important. And just to stay with the vision for a moment, the clarity of vision is very important, because if you don't have a vision, where are you going? What are you doing? What are you trying to achieve? And let me just say, and I hope this is not insulting to anyone, but please don't think of a vision as something like all students will achieve their potential. My goodness, if I had £1 for every time I saw that, I would be a rich person. Education is about getting beyond your potential. It's about doing more than you thought possible. It's having no limits to what you think you can achieve. So have a clarity of vision. And you might say, well, what is a vision? What kind of vision are you talking about? Well, let me give you a quote from the forgive the parochialism of this, 1948 report on Scottish education, a document well worth reading. You can see I'm getting through the in tray by getting to stuff in 19 1948. This was after the Second World War, this report was produced, but there's a line in it that I want to just share with you. It said, see if I can recollect it. The good school is to be assessed not by any tales of examination performance, however impressive, but by the extent to which it has filled the years of youth with security, graciousness, and ordered freedom. The good school is to be assessed not by any tale of examination success, but by the extent to which it has filled the years of youth with security, graciousness, and ordered freedom. And I tell you, I wish I could hear resonance of that for those children suffering from this pandemic, where all we hear is, how are they going to catch up? How are they going to do enough to catch up? A real leader would say, how are we going to give them security, graciousness, and ordered freedom? Because that's what will educate them. It's a deeper thing than just performance. So, forgive me for going on about the vision, but to have a vision is vitally important, because if you don't have a vision of what you're doing as a leader, someone will have one for you, and you won't much like it. So the importance of a vision, and just think wildly about what that vision is. It's not just seeing if they can achieve their potential. It's something deeper and greater than that. Sorry to go on about that. Vision. Next slide. The vision is then put into a mission. The indicative aims. Where is the school going? What are the indicative aims of the school? What is it trying to achieve? So it's got a vision all about hope and all these things. The mission. How is it putting that into practice? How is it developing the aims of the school? And then thirdly, the third area are the values. And these values have to be expressed clearly. So the good strategic thinking in a school is about having a vision, having a mission, having values. And these, again, all interacting with each other. Be clear about the vision, be clear about the indicative aims that flow from that vision, and be clear about the values that are implied by it. And the values are not complicated. I would go back to one of the first slides and say the values derive from hope and love and justice. They are not complicated. Now, you can look at things like the values such as respect. That's presumably a kind of subset of a value related to justice. It's just an expression of justice. So we have to express our values clearly. What are the values of the school? Next slide, please. Values and executive action. So those were the strategic issues we were talking about. So in terms of executive action, executive management is to take those strategic ways of thinking and move from the strategic direction to practical action. So these are the developing the policies of the school, and these policies ought to reflect the strategic vision that you have, but they're putting them into some practical action. Next slide. And again, there has to be a consistency of action with the value that root the values in the community, so that what we're talking about are the policies that then go into a community. So you would have a policy, of course, on things like safeguarding, or a policy on health and safety, a policy on all sorts of things. And these are the executive ways of working. And these should be consistent with the values that we've got in our strategic thinking. So it's taking the strategic values and saying, how are these put into a kind of executive level of operation? And too often in schools, in my view, they start with these sorts of things. We've got a policy on this and a policy on that. Why do you need that policy? Only because you have a strategic view of what the school is trying to do. Next, so these are important areas of putting things into practice, because you've got to determine if the values are being followed. It's all very well to say you want to have a value such as respect and honesty, integrity. Okay, how do you know that's being followed through? How do you know that's happening? And what evidence do you have? Next, please. So, and so that is all about the question of what evidence. Don't just do things and leave them hanging. You need to ask that question, what evidence? Now, please note this. That question is not saying, how do I measure values? It's not saying that. It's asking, what's the evidence by which I can determine that this value is present in the school? Next, please. And so we look at the operational action, the operational activities, and these are undertaken in the classroom and supported by others. So it's the way in which the operational work of the school goes on. It's the way in which the teacher creates an ethos in the relationships of the school, particularly in relationships. Values are carried in the relationships of life. That's where you're developing your values, in the relationships that you create. And so these operational activities are fundamental to carrying the values and supporting others in the relationships that are created in the school. So it's the teacher smiling, it's the nod to the child, it's the recognizing them in the morning, it's the handshake or the elbow bump or whatever we do nowadays. It's all of those sorts of things that are part and parcel of daily living that create the values and carry the values. And Neil has heard me say before, you know, how do children learn? Children learn through the smiling eyes of the teacher. That's what they learn. It's in these operational actions. It's the smiling eyes. They don't just learn by doing another 2 weeks because there's been a pandemic and we've shut schools. Where they're learning is in the smiling eyes of the teacher. And I tell you, I would be more worried by what our education system is doing by putting online so much of education and believing instruction is the same as education. That's a disaster. Now, I'm not saying you can't do certain things online, like what we're doing just now. Now, I can't see all your smiling eyes, and I hope you can't see mine either. But what really is educative is the relationship. And that's why I say, you know, in this with this pandemic, how are we going to create people of hope and love and justice if all they're looking at all day is a screen? So that's just a thought, and we can talk about that later. So next slide. The operational activities are about everyone, and everyone is treated with respect and dignity and in proper relationships. And then again, just to say that in terms of operational working, if we have the next slide, the importance of relationships. Values are carried in relationships. And it's those relationships that create the educated person. And for me, what is happening to the educated person is that these relationships, even for young children, for babies, it's the relationship with their parent or their guardian or whoever's looking after them. It's the relationship that creates the brain cells being developed, the connections in the brain, and knowledge fits in after that. For me, the important thing is the relationships create the connections in the brain. And knowledge is of secondary importance. And it's why I think it's misguided to think in terms of the children who are suffering most from this pandemic. The children who are suffering most are the children who have the poorest relationships with other people. That's the real worry. That's the worry. Because knowledge you can pick up, relationships much more difficult. So operational action, vitally important as part of the values development of schools. So moving on, next slide. Those relationships are seen in every interaction. But what evidence is valid for this? What evidence can we say is valid? I'm saying, you've got to find out what evidence is important. Next slide. Measured evidence, some of the time you can measure things that happen in school that are important, but discerned evidence all of the time. And I want to make that distinction. I mean, if I had a pound for every time I had to say to a doctoral student, don't ask me the question, how do you measure it? The question is, what evidence are you gathering? Because go back to Einstein's thought. Einstein saying that the intuitive mind is the sacred gift. The rational mind is a faithful servant. The rational mind is where you get measured evidence. But you need to discern things. You need to, and that's not just soft. By discerned, I mean, how can you tell whether something's happening or not? You do it by discussion, by looking at things, by looking at how children learn, by looking at their eyes. Are they engaged? Are they this? Good teachers do that all the time. This is not new. This is just simply to say, this is what good education does. People discern through the evidence that they have. And as the teacher walks around and deals with groups of kids and so on, they're looking at discerned evidence. They're not measuring things. So, and the tyranny of measurement is with us in a way that devalues a lot of our education. Because how do you find evidence about hope or love or justice? Characteristically, these are not able to be measured. Now, you can set up surrogate measures for them, but more you can discern them. So look at evidence, but there's two kinds of evidence: measured evidence and discerned evidence. And in values, in my view, discerned evidence is something that we really haven't got to grips with in the system, in the education system, because always what you hear is exam results, performance, outcomes, targets. Not are they dealing with hope and love and justice, or security, graciousness, and ordered freedom. Incidentally, not just any freedom, ordered freedom. Freedom that has an order to it. And if you want to talk about that later, we can do it. Next slide, please. So those are my views on values and where they reside in a sort of leadership structure, which is based on this notion of dispersed leadership. But it's based on, I suppose, the experiences I've had, and they've been mainly in university education. But at the centre of it all are these values that we must hold dearly. And I just hope that anything I've said this evening has been of some interest to you. So thank you for listening, and be happy to have a conversation about what I've said or things that I've not said. And by all means, be in touch with me. There's my address. But
thank you very, very much indeed, Bart. Gosh, wasn't that a tour de force? I was busy writing notes as usual, and I'll listen to the recording again later. So thank you for an inspirational talk there. Helen will pick up again a little later on that. I remember Bart talking in Beirut a number of years ago, and as a young man, I thought I was being terribly wise, really being arrogant. And I had all these wonderful group of people in front of me. And I was talking about peace. And I said to this group, I said, peace is so important. I'm sure that's what you all want. And there was stony silence in the room. And a gentleman with a big beard suddenly put up his hand, and he said, young man, he said, peace is important, but unless you have justice first, you cannot have peace.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was an incredible learning to me, and shows how you were saying about the interaction and weaving together of values. And I loved your 3 values there. But enough from me. I want to give opportunity for our wonderful people who have joined us today. If you would like to either comment or ask Bart a question, if you can think of your questions as in the global sense of interest to everybody, that would be very helpful. So I'm watching for anyone who would like to put up a finger or a hand to say they'd like to speak. Please do not be shy. Those of you without screens on, I can't see you, so I don't know if you're putting up your hand or not. So anyone like to speak?
Make them easy questions, would you?
Yeah. Bridget Knight. Bridget's the CEO of Values-Based Education. Welcome, Bridget, tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Bart, this is the second or third time I've heard you speak, and
oh gosh,
I hope that you can see from the smile on my face just how uplifting you've been tonight. The end of a really long day, the end of a really long term. I'm the teaching head of a small primary school in Herefordshire. We're in lockdown and we're managing the whole situation just like the rest of the country, indeed the world is. So first of all, Bart, thank you for your most uplifting words.
Pleasure, great pleasure.
They
you.
rang so true because they came straight from your heart, I know. And I was writing like mad, and I could listen to you for, days, months. The point that you raised at the very end, the tyranny of measured evidence, and how we measure values like hope and love. How do we get the system to start to relate to this?
Yeah, Bridget, if I say I wish I knew, but in saying that, I have a feeling that collectively we could do something about it. And it may be that this terrible virus and the devastating effects that it's having on our schools may offer an opportunity of us just to stand back a little bit in education and say, what is this all about? In my experience in England, when I worked at Liverpool Hope, one of the things I was struck by there was how, and this is certainly not intended to be a criticism of the English education system, if I was going to do that, I would be much more upfront about it. But when I worked in Liverpool, it did strike me that the word education and curriculum were almost interchangeable. You know, you talk about we educate people, and they're talking about the curriculum all the time. What we're not talking about is pastoral care, and in those days, and that just back 2 or 3 years ago, well-being and mental health and so on. And there is now, one hears huge amounts about well-being and mental health and so on. And I think that may be a way into talking about some of this discerned evidence. Now, the trouble is that if you deal with it through mental health, people see that as a medical model and as a negative. You know, it's because there's a problem. Actually, I think if we could somehow turn that round and say, no, education is about the flourishing of the whole person, the way in which all aspects of our lives, our physical, social, mental, spiritual well-being is flourishing. And that's not easily measured, but we've got to find ways of getting evidence. And that is through, in my view, sort of discernment. So I think a movement, Bridget, that brought that range of concerns, the range of the social, the spiritual, the mental health, these sorts of things, brought it into mainstream instead of the kind of tyranny that I talk about, where it's only exam results that matter. It's only exam results that matter. And you know, in the education systems across the United Kingdom, people are turning upside down, wondering how are we going to get the evidence for certification in secondary schools, you know, and what teachers have got to do and so on. I want to say, you know, that there's more to education than simply certification that is based on performance. It's got to be based on some of these other, in my view, much more fundamental and important aspects of what it is to be a human being. And it may be that using the desperate effects of the pandemic maybe a way of doing it, because I do firmly believe in Scotland they talk about bridging the gap between the poor and the rich in educational terms. And I keep asking the question, when you talk about a gap, what do you mean by a gap? It's a very poor metaphor, because it gives the impression of one-dimensional education that is really just, frankly, about exam performance. If government thought it was bridging the gap, it's to get the exam performance closer. Actually, our concern should be much deeper than that. And it is about how do we support and maximize the needs of every child in their human development. And the ones who are suffering most are those children who have poor relationships at home, weak relationships, no access to computer facilities, no access to peers who can help them and support them. The relationships are weak and fractured, and they're the ones that are going to suffer. And things are just going to get worse and worse unless we can say, no, this isn't just about the curriculum. This is about a much deeper view and a much more significant view of humanity. And it's about the values that we have, valuing young people.